Well, traditionally, multinationals are companies from the US or Europe that have developed a footprint that spans the whole world and mostly into Africa. The Afro Champions Initiative is an initiative that works to turn this trend around by highlighting African companies that grow first on the continent and then into the world. Earlier this month, they launched the $1 trillion investment framework for Africa at the 33rd ordinary session of the AU Heads of State and Government meeting in Addis Ababa, where South Africa was elected the chair of the AU. Dr. Edem Adzogenu is the chair of the Afro Champions Executive Committee, and he joins us now. Dr. Adzogenu, thank you so much for making the time to come through today. You're in South Africa to address the Business Leadership South Africa meeting tomorrow. What are you going to be contributing?
Thank you very much, and I'm happy to be here. I am meeting BLSA Council tomorrow to speak about the CFTA and the opportunities it has for the African private sector as it pursues this agenda to get the private sector to benefit from the investment framework that we've put together called the $1 trillion framework.
All right, we'll talk a bit about that, but I just want to say that you are in South Africa in a week where it's budget week, and in your interaction with governments across the continent, what are the areas that you think the continent should be harmonizing in terms of their budget priorities to make sure that we achieve the ideals of the free trade agreement?
I think the most important thing is the basics. I call them the 5 pillars, food, people must eat, health, education, energy, housing, shelter. And I think that is so instrumental also for creating and generating the economic activity where jobs can be created. Africa has a teeming population of youth who need jobs, who need to be employed. And until you're able to drive entrepreneurship in a way that people can relate to, it's good to build the high-speed trains and all of the other big things that we want to do. But it's important also to focus on the kind of things that affect people directly, which is basically investing in things like affordable housing, bringing low interest rates in that particular regard, and create so much massive jobs, because then it gives opportunity for people in several value chains to be able to participate in that economic activity and as a consequence, drive economic growth. We think that those are very key for also driving continental free trade, because the skill sets that you're going to be requiring to be able to feed people, house people, provide energy for people, and the basic things that people need, which is dignity, is contingent on those pillars.
So in terms of economic growth, why are African countries not taking advantage of the growth in populations? In almost every African country, there's reports of growth in populations. And yet governments and entrepreneurs and businesses are not able to meet this demand.
I mean, just put in perspective, in 10 years, Africa will probably have 40 to 50% of the world's population. I think we should see this as an advantage, as an opportunity, which is why for us, I mean, if you look at India, China, Indonesia, Brazil, all of these countries are taking advantage of the populations, as you said, to drive economic growth. I think Africa, by sheer nature of its size and the fact that it's very fragmented, continues to look within itself as 55 countries, when indeed we are one economic powerhouse. We are one geopolitical giant in the making, and I think CFTA gives us and affords us the ability to be able to do that.
Let's talk about this ideal of the African champions to highlight African companies that are doing well and are really competitive and are generating good revenues. Who are these companies?
We call them Afro Champions simply because they're championing Africa's economic transformation through their cross-border operations. They are companies who didn't exist 15 to 20 years ago, but we've seen the emergence of these companies, sometimes even without the strategic support of governments, who have mushroomed, grown, breaking the barriers that used to block our or regional integration, and are driving Africa's regional integration through their cross-border investments and operations, and as a consequence, moving the country or the continent into global emergence. We have a criteria for determining what makes you an Afro Champion company. We look at things like whether you're headquartered in Africa, ownership of Africans, shareholding, also on your board, We look at how much innovations, local indigenous technology and innovations that you're absorbing in your technologies. We look at how you're making effort to move beyond just your comfort zones, which is your country, your regional comfort zone. So if you move from SADC to ECOWAS, you score more. And also people who move to
different
countries that have cultures, language barriers, breaking language barriers, but also moving to places that have difficult, the ease of doing business in those areas are difficult. So you take a company like EcoBank, they've literally integrated 33 financial markets. Dangote Group, for an example, 20 industrial markets. MTN has literally integrated 20 telco markets. They are occupying spaces that originally used to be occupied, especially in the banking and financial service sector, by global or foreign multinationals. But this is testament to the fact that Africans are building capacity, skill sets, but also setting standards, adopting global standards on the continent and literally moving the country, not only integrating them much better and faster than even the regional economic councils and political networks are doing, integrating this country, moving skill, moving people, moving technology, moving services, and positioning Africa into the global market. They're literally binding the continent. If you look at the recent emergence of Naspers, for example, in partnering with Rakuten to disrupt the global classified industry. Aspen, which is producing pharmaceuticals here and serving the global industry.
So there are tangible examples.
There are many tangible examples. And I should recall 2 years ago, we launched our global African Globalizers report, where we gave tangible examples of local companies that are going multinational and multinational companies that have capacity to go global. The challenge, though, is that Africa still doesn't have one company in the Fortune 500. And we feel, and part of the work of Afro Champions is to drive not only the policy, but the support, incentives necessary to drive Africa's emergence into the global stage where we're missing currently. So
come in the African Union that has just recently, most countries, most members ratified this agreement, the Africa Free Trade Agreement, which allows you to some extent to carry out your work. You launched the Afro Champions $1 trillion private sector at the recent meeting in Addis Ababa. What is it all about?
Thank you. And indeed, what we did was actually had it presented to the heads of states for their endorsement and adoption. The framework is officially going to be unveiled in Ghana, launched on March 10th, where the ministers of finance from across the continent are going to be gathering. And under the auspices of the president of Ghana, who is now the AU chair and AU champion for financial institutions, will be launching the framework. But the $1 trillion framework, basically, which has now been adopted by the heads of states and endorsed, but also by all the organs of the African Union, it's quintessential, in our opinion, to getting the private sector of Africa to move from defensive to offensive, to move from being on the sidelines and trying to expect government and the AU to be able to figure this out. I think that this is the biggest massive golden opportunity that the continent has ever had.
All right. How will this benefit South African business people?
Well, in many ways. South Africa still occupies a significant portion of the continent's economic activity and its GDP. But South Africa on its own will not be able to provide the capacity to sort of weather the market forces that are going to come from the Chinas and Indias and all these other global, even the EU, that are looking at this 1.3 billion consumer market and want to participate in. I think the best that Africa could do is to work with, or South African companies could do, is to begin to position themselves. And the framework clearly gives us the opportunity to understand where the opportunity areas are.
I'm told to wrap up the conversation. Just quickly tell us, if people want to take part in this initiative, how do they go about this? Well,
first, the framework. There's going to be a certification criteria by which you can be able to apply for support for projects. The idea is to catalyze investments into Africa, 100 billion a year, $1 trillion in the next 10 years. We've identified the opportunity areas, the projects, and it's available on our website, www.afrochampions.com. And for African SMEs, we have another flagship program we're driving called the Caravan, which we'll be talking about more. And again, most of this you'll be able to see on the website.
I wanted to ask you about those initiatives, but time doesn't allow. Thank you so much for making the time this morning. Dr. Edem Adzogenu is the chair of the Afro Champions Executive Committee, and he was telling us about the work of the initiative, especially in relation to the Africa Free Trade Agreement.